Hello everyone, it's Mr. Mitchell again, and today we are going to be looking at the second aspect of the Alexander II depth study, where we are going to focus in on whether Alexander's reforms, especially the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, genuinely improved the status of peasants, or whether it actually only caused them more problems as time went on. It is important to start here by reminding ourselves of what serfdom actually was, and why it existed in the Russian Empire at this time. To clarify, a serf was a person that could be bought or sold as labour, and traditionally would be tied to a piece of land, rather than to an individual. A serf wouldn't earn wages, but would be granted a small strip of random land by their noble to live on and farm as they wished, as well as receiving a portion of the harvest they brought in as a form of payment. To show just how archaic this system is, serfs could be bought and sold as payments alongside the land they were on, and could be held by a bank as debt. Even churches owned serfs. A good example of this is Novodevichy Convent in Moscow, which in 1810 owned 15,000 serfs. Serfs could also be gambled by their owners, and when these owners inevitably lost their bets, they would uproot families hundreds of miles to go and settle on new lands, just for the sake of betting. Serfdom on the surface does sound like slavery, but in Russia at this time they are seen as entirely separate concepts, with slavery itself being banned by Peter the Great, I think in 1723, The important distinction to remember here is that slaves were owned by an individual, whereas serfs were technically tied to land. That way, if a noble was awarded land for his efforts in, let's say a war, they would receive land as well as the serfs that were on it. Sometimes as many as 25,000 serfs could be awarded to those who acted with gallantry in the service of the Russian Empire. In practice, there is little difference between the concepts of slavery and serfdom. Both have people that are owned, both are forced to do the things they want to do, both have very little in terms of civil rights. The only difference I would point out, perhaps, is the racial aspect that you encounter when you discuss American slavery. But that's a topic for another period. It may seem bizarre that the serfs did nothing to improve their situation, considering how bad their lives were, and this requires a bit more explanation. The serfs of Russia, first and foremost, were not always happy with it. They were involved in numerous uprisings across the period, which only grew in frequency as time went on. Between the end of the Crimean War, which was in 1856, and the Emancipation Edict in 1861, there were more than 1,200 serf uprisings across Russia. 1,200. Most, admittedly, were small and insignificant, but these often did lasting damage, as the serfs would rise up, they would kill their nobles, they would just burn down houses, and then be put down usually by the police or by the army. On the other side, serfs were also surprisingly content with their position for the most part, as they saw themselves as having inalienable rights to the Russian land. As the fundamental farmers of Russia, they also saw themselves as vital to Russian society, and there's a really famous quote, I can't remember where it's from, which speaks about serfs. Even a small serf, can put food on the plate of the Russian Tsar, i.e. they were necessary for the life of everyone, not just themselves. This was an idea, of course, that the Tsars were very happy to support, as it helped maintain law and order in the countryside. But when it boils down to it, in reality serfs had no rights of their own, and weren't even allowed to marry without permission of the person who was in charge. Serfdom was fundamental to the economy in terms of agricultural production, but also prevented it from advancing with the times. As around 80 to 85% of Russian people were serfs any one time, they couldn't move around to find jobs or move to cities to seek work. This meant that Russia was sort of frozen in time as an agrarian nation, an agricultural nation, as there were no workers moving to the cities to provide labour to factories. This was fine in the 1700s, where most European countries were in a similar position, but as the industrial revolutions in France, Britain and Germany gathered pace, it left Russia only further and further behind as time went on. As mentioned in our last video, Nicholas I, Alexander II's dad if you've forgotten, also saw this as a looming problem, And although he wanted to reform the system, I think he only experimented by ending serfdom in Estonia, which is a tiny, tiny portion of the overall empire. That experiment was also quite unsuccessful, as it led to a Livonian revolt, and he saw serfdom as something that couldn't be tackled just yet. Alexander II, however, was much more keen on this, and partly spurred on by the Crimean War, he sought to end serfdom as soon as was feasibly possible. Alexander II spent many months working on the Emancipation Edict, alongside a peculiar combination of both liberal and conservative ministers. His reasoning behind this was that he wanted a change that was well thought out, and would provide the best outcome for nobles and serfs alike. In 1861, his Emancipation Edict was published, and it proved to be a watershed moment for Russia. This famous painting you've got on screen here by Grigory Mayazoyedov shows the wonder of local serfs finding out about the Emancipation Edict, with light pouring in from outside as illiterate serfs listen to what the young boy is reading. This kind of painting gives a very positive interpretation of the Emancipation Edict, and gives the impression that it was a new dawn for the Russian Empire. However, our debate needs to look at the negative outcomes as well, which actually caused great upheaval and problems for the vast majority of Russian citizens. Now, firstly, we need to understand the Emancipation Edict, and there's no better way than just simply looking at the points of the Emancipation Edict which are the most important. Firstly, all privately owned serfs were freed. Those kept by the state would be entirely emancipated by 1866. Freedom in this instance meant that serfs, or just peasants now, had the right to own property, run their own businesses, marry whoever they wished for the first time, and be legally represented in court. Number 2. Nobles that owned serfs had to hand over a proportion of their land to the serfs that had been freed. Every serf that had been freed was due to receive a certain sliver of land when they were freed. This land was measured and allocated by official surveyors within the local okrugs, counties in English. Number 3. The state provided compensation to nobles and landowners, which was always in the form of money. This was used by the nobility as compensation for the land they had given to the serfs. However, it was also often used to pay off the huge debts that they had built up over the years. The land that they had given away was often valued too highly as well, i.e., they were paid way more than the land was actually worth. This was an attempt by Alexander to keep the nobility happy with the changes. Number 4. The compensation money was actually provided not by the state, not by the government, but by the peasants themselves through something called a redemption payment. It is easier to imagine the redemption payments as payments on a mortgage. When the peasants got land from the nobility, they did not get it for free. And in fact, what they had to do is they had to pay off the value of that land over the next 49 years in yearly sums. Essentially, they had a mortgage on that land, and they had to make repayments every year for the next 49 years. This was to be paid, however, with an extra 6% interest on top, so it was actually more expensive than the land that they had been given, by a considerable degree. The legal ownership of this land was only confirmed after the last payment had been made. 1849 means that this meant that peasants would not own their land formally until 1910. If paying redemption payments was too much for peasants, they could simply opt to go back and work on the nobles' land in order to pay off their debts, which is no different to what they had before. Number 5. The administration of redemption payments, so the organisation of their payment, the repayments, etc., was to be carried out by the village council of elders, also known as the mir. We're going to explain what the mir is later, so don't panic if you haven't heard this phrase before. This group kept a close eye on the land given to peasants, and ensured none of it was sold on to other owners before it had been fully paid for. Finally, number 6, all of these changes would be enacted over the course of a 2-year transition period, i.e., by the end of 1863, all peasants in Russia would be freed, and all land payments would be organised, etc., etc. Now, you can probably start to see some issues with this system, especially around the redemption payments and the land given out, and we will go over the failures of the Emancipation Edict in due course. However, to begin with, to set up one side of the debate, we will have a look at the positive side of these changes. So the reforms taken at face value would pretty much justify Alexander II being called the Tsar Liberator. When we talk about emancipation, we're probably thinking of serfs as being a relatively small section of Russian society, but in actuality we are talking about the lives of arguably 60 million people here. 60 million people were liberated and given freedoms by Alexander II's reform. That is impressive in its own right. Even if everything else went terribly, that is a major point of impressiveness. Freeing the serfs and ending the archaic practice was an enormous step forward for Russia, and it brought it in line with Western European nations who, in the case of Austria as an example, had ended their system of serfdom just over a decade earlier in 1848. Another really good point that historians such as a guy called Robert Massey point out is that this transition and this radical social change was almost entirely peaceful, and there was no serious violence during this social transition. Now, that's impressive in its own right, but this is a really good point of comparison, because there is another instance of massive social change going on at the same time which does end in violence and bloodshed. The American Civil War. In America, in 1861, the Civil War starts over social change, over the legal status of slavery, with the North wanting to abolish slavery, simplistic terms here, and the South wanting to maintain slavery as an economic practice. In 1861, as I said, the same year as the Emancipation Edict was announced, the USA went into civil war over this status, and would lose 600,000 people in the process of a 4-year conflict. Russia avoided that conflict entirely. Again, very impressive. Another thing to point out is the peasantry acquired their own parcel of land, and it gave them their first taste of true freedom. They were able to start businesses, they were able to marry who they want, they were able to be represented in court, and they were able to move around the country largely as they wished to seek work. Because of the last factor, there was a massive influx of ex-serfs into the cities and towns of Russia, providing a labour force for the growing industrial sector of the Russian economy and beginning Russia's own industrial revolution in the process. As a good example of this, the population of Moscow in 1861 was 290,000, but by 1897 you're looking at well over 1.2 million. This was the kind of advancement Alexander II was looking for, and although it did cause problems when it came to housing and sanitation and whatnot, it was a step forward in terms of industrialisation. Now, we would be naive to think that the Emancipation Edict was an entirely positive experience for everyone involved, and while our previous discussion of the positives may paint a good picture of the outcome, in reality it was far from fully successful. First and foremost, the nobility suffered tremendously from this emancipation, with significant sources of income being forcibly removed from them. Those who were slow to adapt to the new conditions were often faced with bankruptcy, and had to sell off their land and property, which had often been with noble families for hundreds of years. A good example of this is the Trubetskoy family, a noble family which had been in Russia basically since 1400s, 1500s. They were faced with bankruptcy and had to sell a significant portion of their land, some of which contained buildings which had been hundreds of years old by that point. By 1905, only 40% of land was still owned by nobles, and this continued to decline by about 1% every year until 1917, when this land was forcibly seized by the Bolsheviks and redistributed to the peasants. Many peasants also reacted badly to the reforms because they were allocated much worse land than they previously had, and the most valuable land was kept by the nobles. There are examples of peasants being given land which is marshy or covered with stones, land that is not suitable for farming and therefore can't be used productively. This was largely because of the corrupt nature of the official surveyors, which were sent to administer the land changes. They were regularly bribed by the nobles so that they could keep the most land, the most useful land. This meant that peasants, more often than not, gained less from their land than they had before the Emancipation Edict, effectively meaning that they were now poorer. Many peasants, much like the nobility, also struggled to adapt to the changes, and couldn't pay off their redemption payments properly. This was made worse by the fact that the peasantry, which were now classed as the free people of Russia, now had the honour of being considered eligible to pay poll tax. The peasants were also given freedoms, but these freedoms were of limited value to them when they continued to be constrained by the village mir. Now, I mentioned the mir earlier, and it is a very complicated concept which we will cover in lessons to come, but I like to think of them as sort of naggy and pressuring grandparents that sort of push you to act in a certain way, or dress in a way that they want you to, or not dye your hair. You know the kind, I'm sure. So these council of elders, this mir, had to be approved. They had to approve of any decisions that people in the village made, and this meant that when someone was trying to find someone to marry, they had to be approved by the village mir. If someone wanted to start a business, it had to be approved by the village mir. They had to go through this group that basically decided everything for them. They still were controlled. There was still that sense of control that the nobles had. It just been transferred to another group. The village mir also prevented peasants from moving away from something called subsistence farming, which is where you farm essentially just to feed yourself. And that meant there was no real incentive to produce more food to be sold at market, and therefore to increase productivity and increase profit. I'm sure by now that you can see that this Emancipation Edict has some really stark positives, but some really serious negatives at the same time. And historians are divided on whether Alexander's reforms truly improved the status of the peasantry, or whether he only actually made their situation worse. Some historians, like J.N. Westwood, whose interpretation you can see on screen, view his reforms positively, identifying that they made real change and brought Russia into the modern age. Other historians, such as John Grenville, as you can see on screen, they would disagree, arguing that he only succeeded in making the people of Russia less happy with their conditions and their lives. Ultimately, it is up to you what you think about Alexander II's changes here, and their impact on the status of the peasants in Russia, but more important than that is our ability to make judgments on the convincingness of the interpretations we are given, much like the ones we just saw. Whenever you get an interpretation like this, I would strongly recommend highlighting areas that are convincing in one colour and highlighting areas that are unconvincing in another colour. First thing you do when you receive them, this is it. Once you've highlighted convincing and unconvincing aspects, annotate them with knowledge that you will need to back up whether they're convincing or unconvincing. You can see that I have chosen a convincing and unconvincing aspect from J.N. Westwood's passage, and what I've done is I've explained my reasoning using contextual knowledge alone on each side. Remember that we don't use provenance when we are looking at these interpretations, we only use contextual knowledge. Although this might seem like an odd way of doing things, I would like my class, and Miss Hart I'm sure will say the same, to get into a habit of doing this every single time you encounter an interpretation. It is a really, really good point to start off on, and it helps set up an argument as to which one is more convincing and why. I hope this has all been very useful for you. I strongly recommend listening over this and previous videos and making notes on it, as this is the best way to impart knowledge to you in the current situation we're in. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me at mitchellc@aesessex.co.uk and I will happily answer them for you. Have a lovely day, and thank you very much for listening.